That was entitled The Five Smooth Stones of Religious Liberalism. And I will be talking about that today. Wow. As well as the Hajj and Yom Kippur. If those seem like wildly different things, they actually all three have a few things in common. The first one is that they're all about stones. The second is that they are about this time of year. And the third is that they all three have their origins in the Hebrew Bible. So let's start with Hajj. Everybody knows, or at least many people know, that the Hajj is the Muslim's pilgrimage. And most of you know that, in fact, the Hajj is required of every observant Muslim at least one time in their lives. Now, so here's what you may not understand, is that in fact, stick to the mic. In fact, unlike Christian pilgrimage, which can be done at any time of the year, Hajj must be done on the last month of the Muslim calendar. So in fact, that's why there were over 2 million Muslim pilgrims in Mecca during this past few weeks. And it's not just a matter of going there. There are specific activities that have to happen at specific times. So in fact, when we hear about the 700 people who were killed and the 800 who were injured, that terrible tragedy happened because, in fact, they all had to be there at that particular time of day. Now, the Hajj generally traces activities that are associated with the Prophet Muhammad. But in addition to that, there are other items in the Quran that speak to, for example, the Prophet Abraham. And one of these legends, one of these stories from the Quran, is the story of Abraham and Ishmael. In the Hebrew Bible, it's Abraham and Isaac. But the story goes that Abraham was instructed by God to take his concubine Hagar and their son Ishmael out into the desert and leave them. There was no water in this desert, and so Hagar ran between two hills 7 times, searching for water. She found none. And finally, she collapsed. And she gave up her will and said, I surrender to the will of God. At that point, an angel appeared, struck the ground with his heel, and a well and water came forth from the earth. This is known as the well of Zamzam, which is located very close to the Kaaba. And it must be kind of miraculous, since 1,500 years later, it's still giving out water. So Abraham left Hagar and Ishmael there. He went away. Later, he came back. And God instructed him to sacrifice his son Ishmael. Abraham said, I will do this. And Satan and Shaitan came and tempted him. He said, That's stupid. You don't want to kill your own son. Why would you do something like that? But Abraham believed that it was the will of God that he do so. And so he picked up 7 stones and threw them at the devil, at Shaitan, and drove him away. Hagar, Ishmael's mother, was tempted to stop Abraham. The devil, Shaitan, came to Hagar and said, "Don't let him kill your son." But it was God's will. And so she picked up 7 stones and threw them at Shaitan and drove him away. And finally, Shaitan went to Ishmael and said, "Don't let him do this." And Ishmael, believing that it was the will of God, picked up 7 stones, cast them at the devil, and drove him away. And so this is a really important part of Hajj, where Muslims are required to cast 7 stones at 3, which used to be obelisks. Now they're walls 85 feet long. And 2 million pilgrims during Eid al-Adha cast 7 stones at these walls. They are referred to as Jamra. And the Saudi, just little factoids, the Saudi government has built what's known as the Jamarat Bridge, which actually has 2 levels. And so people can stand on either the top level or the ground and throw these 7 stones at the wall. Apparently, folks do get hit by stones. Now, they have to hit these, and so that happens one day, and then the next day they have to do 3 walls. So a total of 49 stones have to hit these walls. For Muslims, this tradition is the idea of rejecting temptation. Here's the thought. We cannot know what the future holds. We cannot know what God, Allah, has in store for us. And so when we are asked to do things even which seem illogical, we don't know what the outcome will be. And they realize, and Muslims realize, that they are not truly in control. That in fact, there is a higher power, God, the universe, whatever, that is really in control. Thus, the concept of submission to the will of God. Which then, oddly enough, brings me to Yom Kippur. We know of Yom Kippur as the Day of Atonement. Now, the tradition holds that, in fact, God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And he brought the tablets down to the people, to the Israelites, who had, while he was gone, created a golden calf, which they were worshiping. Moses saw this golden calf and broke the stones. 10 days, the people repented. And then God gave Moses a second set of tablets. Yom Kippur is probably one of the 2 most important holy days for Jews throughout the world. Even non-observant Jews go to synagogue, they fast, and they pray on Yom Kippur. Those 10 days between Yom Kippur, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are known as the days of awe. In Jewish tradition, what happens is during those 10 days, God judges human beings. And on the 10th day, on Yom Kippur, the book of life is closed. So during those 10 days, you are asked to look at your life, to look at how you have offended others, and to make amends if you possibly can. Author Kana Webster, who is the editor of the Jewish Woman org, writes, "The Hebrew word ha-satan, the Satan, is equivalent to, and numerically to 364. In Jewish theology, Satan refers to forces and voices that, quote, distract us, tempt us, and alienate us from listening to our inner selves. The Satan has power over us for 364 days of the year, but on the 365th day, on the holy day of Yom Kippur, we can reach a level of self-awareness and oneness. On this day, outer temptations, diversions, dichotomies, fragmentations, enticements, and whatever blocks our inner voice from being heard do not have such a hold. These layers are stripped away as we finally come face to face with the potent power of our own souls." And while this is not exactly the same, I believe it closely correlates with this idea of driving away temptation, because Islam focuses on casting away temptations and submitting to the voice of Allah, of God. But as folks who have a strongly humanist bent in our theologies, we would think of this as the Jewish concept of peeling away forces and voices that distract us from facing the power of our own souls. It is that idea of God within or God without. And they're all the same thing. The Hebrew word for that we think of as atonement is a really interesting one. It's teshuvah, which means literally to return. We're returning to that place of peace, of centering, of knowing who we are and what we're about. Both traditions recognize the human condition. They know that we have a tendency to be distracted from who we are and what we're about. They know that for folks who are not theists, we can be distracted from this concept of working toward a better world. And whether or not you believe in a deity, believe in God, it still means that we lose focus. And we must lay down our guilt and refocus on what is important. So, this idea of stones, I think, is a really good one. I often tell people we're all carrying around a bag of rocks. And I believe that to be true. There was a fellow that I talked with fairly recently who he felt betrayed by a lover from 10 years ago. And he couldn't get past it. It affected every relationship that he had with every other lover. So both of these holy days invite us to put down the stones we're carrying. They may be a part of us, but they don't have to define us. Which brings me to the 5 smooth stones that Ed so... I still can't get over it. That was still so great. Those 5 smooth stones derive from the story of David and Goliath. Most of you know the story of David and Goliath. The Israelites and the Philistines were fighting. The Old Testament is full of the Israelites fighting with people. This happened to be the Philistines. Now, the Philistines had this guy, Goliath. Big fella, over 9 feet tall. And he had armor of bronze. And for 40 days, and the Israelites and the Philistines were on opposite sides of a valley. And for 40 days, in the morning and in the evening, Goliath would come out and challenge the Israelites. Send out your best guy, fight me, and we can be done with this. I didn't write the Bible, so I don't really know why, but apparently this frightened the Israelites quite badly. Now, David was a shepherd, and he came into the Israelite camp one day and heard them talking about this guy, this Goliath, and he said, you know what, I'll do it. Everybody was like, but you're a shepherd. And he said, I'll do it. So Saul, who was the king at the time, put armor on Goliath and said, go fight Goliath. Thank you. Put armor on David. He didn't put armor on Goliath. And David said, this is too heavy. I can never fight in this. And so he took off the armor and picked up 5 smooth stones. He took those smooth stones and put them in his sling, along with his staff. And he went and fought Goliath, and we all know what happened there. So in this sense, those stones were a kind of ammunition to fight what we might think of as ignorance. James Luther Adams was one of the preeminent UU ministers of the 20th century. He lived from 1901 until 1994. Many of my colleagues actually studied with James Luther Adams, and he was a brilliant, brilliant scholar. And like many brilliant scholars, his writings are really quite dense. And he wrote one of these very dense essays that's published in On Being Human Religiously, Selected Essays in Religion and Society. And one of those essays is The 5 Smooth Stones of Religious Liberalism. My friend and colleague, Reverend Fred Hammond, of the UU Fellowship in Church of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, writes, I wish Unitarian Universalists paid more attention to theology and things like Adam's 5 smooth stones than they do to the 7 principles of the UUA. The 5 smooth stones are really where our heart is at and really what we're all about. The 5 smooth stones are where we find so much common ground with so many people. And so, what are those 5 smooth stones? They are that revelation and truth are not closed, but are constantly revealed. That, number 2, all relations between persons ought ideally to rest on mutual free consent and not coercion. Number 3, affirmation of the moral obligation to direct one's effort toward the establishment of a just and loving community. Number 4, denial of the immaculate conception of virtue and affirmation of the necessity of social incarnation. Good must be consciously given form and power within history. And number 5, the resources, divine and human, that are available for achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate, but not necessarily immediate, optimism. There is hope in the ultimate abundance of the universe. I told you this stuff was dense. And so, in a nutshell, here's what this is about. Revelation and truth are not closed, but are constantly revealed. There is always something new to find. All relations between persons ought ideally to rest on mutual free consent and not coercion. We must be free agents. We must be responsible for our own lives. Affirmation of the moral obligation to direct one's efforts toward the establishment of a just and loving community. It is our responsibility to work to make the world a better place. Denial of the immaculate conception of virtue and affirmation of the necessity of social incarnation. It's not going to get done unless we do it. And it doesn't happen automatically. It must be given form. And the resources that are available for achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. We have reason to be optimistic because we can do it. It is possible to do this. Now, I have to tell you, at this time in our nation's history, we are faced with unprecedented challenges, most of which we've brought on ourselves. Our elected officials seem more interested in casting stones than in looking for solutions. They're more interested in blaming the poor than in eliminating poverty. There are even supposedly Christian congressmen, fervent believers and followers of Ayn Rand. They use Christian doctrine on behalf of austerity toward the poor. In his address to Congress, Pope Francis, good man that he is, spoke about the moral responsibility to welcome immigrants. Is it not what we want for our children? He asked. Iowa Representative Steve King's response to that? Immigration would sink America, and the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. It seems that right-wing conservatives who tout their faith to get elected are quick to dismiss Christian leaders when the call for moral action comes for climate change or immigration reform. So yes, sometimes I despair. But things like these 3 stories, they call me back. They remind me of who I am and what I want to do in the world. They clear my vision a bit. I know I cannot save the world. But even small acts can drive the devils of despair and distraction away. I do often hurt myself and those around me. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it is. Mostly it's just thoughtless, stupid. And Yom Kippur reminds me to call myself back, to peel away those layers of vanity and to make amends where I can, to forgive myself for being the imperfect person that I am. And finally, Adam's 5 smooth stones remind me that I am part of a much larger movement, one whose torch I bear from many generations past. These people like Dorothy Day, who work for justice. It reminds me to live abundantly and to find wholeness where we can, and to have hope that the arc of the universe does indeed truly bend toward justice. And so, wonderful people that you are, I invite you to carry those stones with you. Carry those bags of stones. You're going to do it anyway. And know that they're a burden, but they can also be tools. Tools to make your life and the lives around you a better place. Amen.